Hi everyone. I'm very pleased to be participating in this year's Library Publishing Forum, and I'll be sharing some work that I've been doing around open book publishing in my capacity as the Open Monograph Press Coordinator for the Public Knowledge Project. So I joined the PKP team in September last year, and they brought me on to give some dedicated attention to OMP. OMP is the sibling project to OJS, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And for various reasons, it hasn't had the same attention over the years, but the time is right to look at it again as things have been changing in the book publishing landscape. And for PKP, the commitment remains to support all kinds of research publishing and scholarly publishing, which includes books and other kinds of content that is supported by OMP. So my job was to evaluate the platform itself, conduct some user research, and to help PKP situate OMP within the broader open book publishing landscape. And of course, if you know anything about PKP, you know we have a very global community. And so the projects that I engaged with were representative across various continents and give a really interesting view into the things that we have in common across lots of different publishing contexts. So I'll start with a very brief history of OA publishing, OA book publishing specifically. If you know anything about it, you know that progress has been much slower than with journal publishing. Part of that has to do with the process of book publishing. It's really opaque. The way that book publishing has happened has been professionalized, and that expertise has been held within presses in such a way that most academics don't have visibility on it. And without that visibility, it's much more difficult to replicate and adapt and innovate in that space. Presses have also played a role of conferring prestige to the books that they publish. There is a stamp of approval that happens with the acquisition and publishing by a particular press, and people are very attached to that. So it's a difficult thing to work around. The other thing is that the vast majority of university presses are built around a sales model, which is different to the subscription model of journals. And then, of course, books are most valued in the humanities and social sciences, and those fields are chronically underfunded. All that said, there's absolutely progress that is being made. One of the really great trends we've seen over the past decade or so is the launch of new open access presses. Because the traditional closed access university press is such a rigid model, there has been some move towards hybrid OA models within those presses, but very few, if any, have really been able to transform or been motivated to transform into being fully open access. So these new players are really critical because they get to start from scratch and they get to build their model on open access as the default and work out their funding from there. In parallel, as we well know in this context, there's been huge growth in institutional publishing. In North America, it's really noticeable that the book publishing piece of this has been predominantly around open textbooks. We're also seeing more expansive definitions of scholarship being taken up, which is really amazing to see. So, recognizing that there are more ways to create and circulate knowledge than just in books and journals. That's been a really crucial part of this movement as well. And alongside that, platforms have really had an impact. Again, to distinguish North America from other regions, the funding strategy from the Mellon Foundation of, 10 to 15 years ago now, really had an impact on prioritizing digital production platforms and web reading, which has certainly ended up in some really fantastic tools available. In Europe, there was somewhat of a broader approach to the infrastructures necessary for open access book publishing that's resulted in some great structures around dissemination and indexing. But that said, we run immediately into the very common challenge with open infrastructures that while these platforms are being adopted across both sides of the Atlantic. Most regions outside of Europe and North America really struggle to be able to afford them, plain and simple. The other side of that, of course, is that open infrastructures are very difficult to run sustainably. And we've seen the impact of that just recently, where Knowledge Futures, which developed PubPub, has had a big shift in their strategy, orienting themselves towards enterprise clients, which has left a lot of small independent publishing communities who were using the platform really at a loss. And so there's certainly nothing simple here around the platforms and infrastructures that are being developed. So from this review of OMP and interacting with OMP users, it's been really clear that what is common across most regions globally is that people are publishing more than just traditional scholarly books. And with that interest, they are creating publishing workflows that suit that. So while there are plenty of programs out there operating as a university press with a traditional process with an open access output, there are very many who are also publishing different kinds of content and not trying to replicate that process. So of the people who are doing this kind of non-traditional publishing, they still want to use the infrastructures and the good practices for scholarly communication that we've been developing. So there's a lot of value in our existing systems that they are and want to further take advantage of. This next point is not surprising, but obviously important in the context of OMP. Most people publishing books are also publishing journals. Almost all of the OMP users that we spoke to were also using OJS quite extensively, which goes to this idea that we have more in common than not. And so we can understand our user community together in that sense. And then the last thing that I've really noted is that there is still a huge amount of untapped potential in this space around books and long form publishing. There is amazing innovation, experimentation out there happening, and it hasn't had the time or the resources to really evolve. And so there's a lot more here that we'll be able to explore in coming years. So I'll take us through a few brief case studies of OMP. I'll start us off in Indonesia. There is a huge boom in open access activity in Indonesia. PKP has really seen this through the adoption of OJS. We now have community liaisons in Indonesia, and it's really amazing to see that interest is translating across two different formats. So you'll see here from Erlangen University Press, they have over 1,000 published works, and they have a huge range of types. So it's textbooks, references, monographs, poetry, comics, novels. It's really cool range of work that they're supporting on behalf of the faculty of their university. University of Cape Town Libraries has a cool model where they, within the library, have both a traditional university press, open access, and a library publishing program that can engage a little more creatively with things like textbooks and proceedings. And so between those two, they share resources, they share infrastructure, and kind of create a cohesive program serving different needs. I couldn't not include at least one open textbook example. So TU Delft out of the Netherlands, they publish all kinds of content, but for their textbooks, they have a cool way of connecting Jupyter, which they use to create interactive textbooks, with the OMP catalog of works. So all of those examples have been very institutionally focused. I wanted to show that that's not the only case. Book Archive, I'm not supposed to have favorites, but it's really a project after my own heart. So it's an experimental open access repository for books and other kinds of long form content. And they publish a lot around design and architecture and things like that. So it looks beautiful, and it's just a very cool initiative that's underway. And then again, in the realm of not being at an academic institution, I came across in my review CODESRIA, the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa, which is an NGO, and they are an incredibly prolific publisher. They have almost 2,000 works out there across a real range of content types. So, throughout this research, the question that I think still remains wide open is what do we mean by book? Those of us in open book publishing spaces, working on the infrastructures, things like that, a lot of us are using the term book really broadly as a catch-all, that it can contain a monograph, but also a zine, for example. But in the long run, we do something of a disservice to ourselves by making book such a general term. You'll see in here, I've been incorporating long form scholarship and try to kind of add some nuance to the language, which I think is really important. And it's never ideal to define yourself in opposition to something. So it's kind of, we don't want to be in territory where we're talking about journals and things that aren't journals. But there is still something missing from our language to really capture this broad set of work that is being circulated. So, in terms of paths forward for you in library publishing, I really want to encourage you to keep expanding that definition of scholarship and look for places where you can amplify other kinds of publications alongside books to really create that rich environment. And I know that a very valid concern for supporting open book publishing within library publishing programs is that the author expectation is often very high in terms of what will be done on their behalf as an editorial process. It goes back to that press model where the author hands off a manuscript and then 2 to 5 years later they get a book to hold in their hands. That's not the only way that publishing can be done. There's an education component because of the expectations people have, but there is a lot of room for us to approach that differently and work out other ways that we can be honing in on the actual value of what they're trying to do with that process and think about it in a different way. And the case studies that I've shared show some ways in which you can support this kind of publishing without needing to be a really traditional press. I'll also say, as a publisher, coming from the perspective of a publisher, I really encourage you to remember that dissemination is such a key part of publishing. Publishing is to make public, which means finding the ways to make things available to the people who can benefit from them. And again, when we're not in a traditional press, that doesn't have to look like marketing, where you're trying to sell the book to people and you're getting, advanced copies sent out. None of that. We use the tools that we have. We use the tools around indexing, leveraging DOIs, ORCIDs, other persistent identifiers. All of that is doing this work of publishing in a really important way as well. Um, as always, look for those opportunities to bridge divides. There's far more in common than not, and I think as we bring these fields closer together, we can better understand our differences and not fear them so much. And then, I say this in full recognition of the impossible moment in the US right now. The work needs to be funded. There's a lot of that will be lost because that will not get funded in at least the next few years. Um, that said, where possible, each of us has an opportunity and a responsibility to fund what we can. And that goes for institutions outside the US who have some slack to pick up or need to be thinking about their strategy in this new context because we're in harm reduction mode essentially. How can we get the least bad outcome from a bad situation? For OMP specifically, I'm sticking around for another 6 months to implement some of the recommendations coming from the report. So the findings of my review are going to be shared in a public report, and I'll also be continuing to look for research opportunities to help us better understand the landscape as it is today. And I'll end on a thank you and an invitation to reach out if you'd like to talk more about this. I'm available to help you figure out a strategy around publishing books and long form content if you want to. I really appreciate that this is a world that feels very unknown to a lot of folks, and will do what I can to help clear up the uncertainties, which has been a big part of this work with PKP. So I thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.